Welcome to Living with Reality, a podcast featuring archived teachings and modern conversations with Dr. Robert Svoboda, brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. Living with Reality explores Ayurveda and other wisdom traditions of India, which Dr. Svoboda has been studying for nearly 50 years. For more information, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Dr. Svoboda. That's DRSVOBODA. Hello, and welcome to the Living with Reality podcast. I'm Paula Crossfield, your host and Dr. Svoboda's media manager. This week on the podcast, we have a very special treat for you. Dr. Svoboda is in conversation with Scott Blossom, who is an acupuncturist and Ayurvedic practitioner, and who teaches with Dr. Svoboda about Ayurveda and the microbiome. And the conversation they're having today is about the oral microbiome. This conversation serves as a preview to the third in a series of courses that they've done on Ayurveda and the microbiome. These are very thorough looks at the importance of the microbiome from a scientific perspective, but also what we can do, a lot of them practices that come out of Ayurveda that can really help us to thrive. So we really hope you enjoy the content today. You can find out more about this course and other courses at drsvoboda.teachable.com. And if you'd like to learn more about this specific course, you can add a / oral microbiome to find out more. We hope you enjoy.
Namaste and greetings. It's a great pleasure to be here today with my friend and colleague, Dr. Scott Blossom, to talk about the microbiome. The microbiome is extremely important. Happily, its importance is becoming more and more a matter of awareness among not only scientists, but also ordinary people who want to be healthy. The microbiome is the population of, the communities of, the interactions of all of the single-celled organisms, bacteria, fungi, archaea, even viruses, that live on and in the physical body. And as we are now learning, the microbiome is an integral part of a living human body. It's really an organ in itself. And in February, Dr. Scott and I will be presenting our third in a series of teachings on the subject of the microbiome, particularly as it intersects with the subject of Ayurveda. And this third iteration that we'll be doing next month will be on the subject of the oral microbiome. And to give you a little bit of an overview about that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Dr. Scott for that purpose.
Great. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here with you again. And yes, the subject of the microbiome is only becoming more relevant and more clearly a central aspect of understanding human health and longevity. And as we have delved into what our first course was a more general overview, and then the second course was a deep dive into the gut-brain axis, it becomes clear that the systems thinking approach that was employed by Ayurvedic, the thinkers and seers that were the progenitors of Ayurvedic medicine, that systems thinking mindset is precisely the kind of truths that research on the microbiome is presenting. And in one way, you could say it very simply that everything is connected to everything else, but that those connections are not just simple, sort of one thing is existing next to something else, as much as there's very, very profound relational interactions that are happening, not only between the human and its microbiota, the collection of organisms that live in and on it, but also with your environment, and then the choices that you're making around what you eat, how you breathe, how you even speak and think, having a very profound potential for supporting not only your human organism, but also the microbiota that live within you. And so in the case of the oral microbiome, the understanding that is really sort of, I think, where you can see an intersection between Ayurveda and the current science about the oral microbiome is in that there's a great emphasis on oral health care in Ayurvedic medicine. Many of the daily practices that are recommended actually involve things that either clean the mouth or involve having herbs or foods that are recommended to eat to promote the health of the mouth. And just as the gut microbiome research is really starting to create a picture of how the gut microbiome affects us, our entire human physiology and psychology, the oral microbiome in many ways is a gateway to that. And that's partly because the term in science is that there is concordance between the oral microbiome and the gut microbiome, which is to say that the oral microbiome is a kind of proxy for what you're going to find in your gut. And in some ways, it is the first gateway or first interactive field within the body for developing a healthy microbiome. And so, as many of us know, having a healthy mouth is going to do important things like prevent cavities, prevent gum inflammation. It also, as we probably know, the mouth produces enzymes in the saliva that we excrete when we're trying to chew or swallow food or drink. And basically those kind of basic activities, I think, are well known, but what's coming out in the science around the oral microbiome and in general is that there is very profound implications for farther reaching aspects of our health, like our cardiovascular health, our lung health, our brain health, and even things that may seem very distant, like our sexual health. And so we're going to be going into those kinds of subjects with an eye both on the modern research and the Ayurvedic approach to understanding them as well as supporting them. Would you like to add any comments to that, Dr. S?
Well, I would, and I think what I would like to do is talk just a little bit about the so-called gut-lung axis. And the mouth, of course, being part of the gut. And there is a definite, though very poorly understood so far, connection between the lung and the colon and the lung and the mouth. And Ayurveda, of course, identifies very profoundly and substantially a link between the lung and the colon. Chiefly from the perspective of how prana is taken into the body. Prana is immediately nourished in the body through the lung by our breathing, and nourished in a delayed way from the colon via the food that we eat, from which the prana is extracted. So prana is being taken in from both places. Prana is also, of course, present in all living beings, and since there is the major part of the microbiome in the organism is in the colon, and there is a significant presence of microbes and microbial products in the lungs, even in healthy lungs, there is definitely going to be a connection there. And part of that, of course, will happen via its connection to the mouth, since both breathing and swallowing happens through the mouth. So one of the things that we're going to be examining during this oral microbiome course will be the connections that we can find not only between the oral microbiome itself, but the way that the organs and the microbiomes that they host interact with one another. The lung and the colon developed from the same embryological source, from the endoderm, and they have many similarities, but they also have several differences. And one big difference from the point of view of the microbiome is that there is a generally stable microbiome in the colon, and in the lung, there is not normally a resident population of single-celled organisms. It's more of a transient population. Bacteria and archaea and other substances and organisms that come and go, but don't necessarily create a resident community there. What does happen, and of course this is the case in many people who have pathologies in the lung, what does happen is that when there is an infection in the respiratory tract, that's the time that a resident population of bacteria tend to get created. And then, of course, there will be an interaction between that temporary microbiome and the other microbiomes in the organism. So at that point, there will be interactions involving not just the physiology of the organism, but also the immune response of that organism to the disease process, whatever it happens to be. This is something that is only now being evaluated carefully. It's very little of it is understood. But what we have seen so far is that up to 50%, up to half of adults that have irritable bowel disease, and as many as a third of the people who have just even irritable bowel syndrome also have some kind of disturbance in their lungs. It might be inflammation, it might be some impairment of lung function. Even if those patients don't have any history of respiratory disease. So once the colon gets disturbed, that disturbs the lung. In Ayurveda, we say that the reason for this is if the colon is disturbed, you're not taking in enough prana from the colon, and that puts stress on the lung to try to take in more prana. And here is the place where, yet again, we have to emphasize the importance of breathing abdominally, both because it helps to exercise the colon, to get things to move within it properly, and also because taking in breath deeply and slowly and regularly ensures that the lung tissue will be as relaxed as possible, and we will be taking in the maximum amount of prana through the lung as possible. Other relations also have been identified. Patients with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, are 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with irritable bowel disorder. People who have asthma are also very likely to have functional disturbances and alterations in their intestines. as are often people with COPD, taking antibiotics early in life that affect the microbiome in the gut very often encourage the development of allergic airway disease. All of these connections are now being identified, but they're not always easy to understand. For example, infection with H. pylori, which produces ulcers in many people, decreases the incidence of asthma and allergy, but increases the incidence of COPD and other chronic bronchial diseases. So that same bacteria that is not a normal constituent of the stomach may encourage positive results in one area of the pulmonary experience, the pulmonary tree, but it may discourage positive results in another context. So there is a lot that we do know and that we can present, but there is a lot that still remains to be understood about the lung and the microbiome. And this, of course, is even more true about the relation between the microbiome and the cardiovascular system. And I'm going to go back to Dr. Scott to request him to proceed ahead in that context.
Yeah, thank you. It's really fascinating how in both traditional Chinese medicine and in Ayurveda, the lung and the large intestine were associated from the beginning of the articulation of those theories of health and longevity. And so, to take your cue and move into the cardiovascular system, I'm going to start with, something as a way in to kind of start with the mouth and then continue that way, which is one of the most basic pieces of science that's really established about how to have a healthy mouth to prevent things like sensitivity in the mouth, gum inflammation, cavities, infection, is to consume a diet and consume the diet in a kind of rhythm and manner that doesn't make the mouth too acidic. And so when the mouth becomes too acidic, it actually promotes an environment where some of the pathogenic microbes are able to breach the kind of bulwark that's created by the commensal microbes. The commensal ones are neutral and positive. You could call them probiotic and biotic organisms. But these pathogenic organisms only really get their capacity to create havoc inside of your mouth, and that is not actually limited to the mouth, because certain kinds of infection can definitely influence the lungs, the heart, the whole body. But basically, we know that keeping the pH within a certain range, the acidic quality of the mouth within a certain range, is very, very important. And so two of the things, for example, that Ayurveda recommends that's probably well known to most of you who are going to be watching this is that it can be useful to chew something like fennel and or cardamom seeds after a meal. And it's also encouraged that people take time between meals, space their meals out, so that they're not constantly grazing through the day or constantly sipping on sweetened drinks or something that has a sugary content, or an alcoholic content, or even a carbonated content, actually. And this is partly because in the case of the fennel and cardamom, there's actually some research that has finally been done to show that you actually get a reduction in the acidic quality inside of the mouth by chewing those seeds. They have that effect. So that's going to have not only the effect to keep the pathogenic bacteria in check, it also has an effect on protecting your enamel and protecting the mineralization of your teeth, and also protecting your teeth from cavities. And so the second point that I was making there that I think is useful is that also the idea about spacing meals is not just so that the digestive tract has a chance to rest, which is very important because there's aspects of the digestive tract that require rest and require a kind of quiescence to do their work. But it's also that if you take time between meals, that also allows the pH, the acidity in the mouth, to balance itself out in a way that's conducive to, especially if somebody's going to be sipping water or non-sweetened beverages, something like herbal teas, something like that, between meals. It's a way to, maintain a healthy pH balance in the mouth, which has this entire systemic influence, and particularly in the context of the cardiovascular system. And so there's a recent study that came out about footballers in Europe, so soccer players for all the Americans in Europe, where they were able to study and show that the health of the microbiome actually has an impact on the benefit of cardiovascular exercise. And so, yes, they were using professional athletes who are doing very vigorous cardiovascular exercise, but of course, we all know that cardiovascular exercise benefits people and is a really critical component, not only of physical fitness, but cardiovascular health, mental, emotional health. Actually, your gut microbiome balance is encouraged when somebody is getting regular cardiovascular exercise. But what they found was that because these professionals tended to be, you can imagine the environment they're in is they're in a situation where there's lots of these energy drinks and sport products around them, and a lot of them are having this dual situation where they're becoming dehydrated because they'll play long periods of time where they're breathing really heavily, and that dries out the tissues in the mouth as well as their body. But then in between, they'll be having Gatorade, or they'll be having a sports drink of some kind that's usually sweetened. And each time that you do that, it actually feeds the microbes in a way that temporarily increases the acidity of the mouth, and then will start to create, actually, in the case of these footballers, dental problems that are the same or worse than the general population. And that the secondary effect is that they're not actually processing some of the beneficial foods that the trainers and people who are trying to keep them at their peak performance levels would be encouraging, foods that would support healthy lungs and cardiovascular function, for example. And this was the really key discovery, is that they found out that it had something to do with this group having suboptimal oral microbiome composition, as well as just oral care, partly because of the culture that they're in and the way that they have to live their lives as professional athletes, who eat and drink in a particular way, and then also do a lot of very intense physical exercise. So this is, I wanted to use an example to try to point this out, but we'll be going much more in depth because Ayurveda is ingenious in all the ways that it supports the cardiovascular system in indirect ways. Cardiovascular exercise is a very direct example, but there's a two-way street here. If you support the cardiovascular system and you're supporting the oral microbiome, they mutually support each other. And it can also influence things as distant as sexual function. And I think Dr. Svoboda has some interesting comments to make about that, because sexual function is essentially an extension of good cardiovascular health.
Indeed it is. And it has been shown that the health of the teeth, and in particular the gums that support the teeth, the health of the teeth and gums is directly connected to the potential for what is called in modern medicine ED, erectile dysfunction. And this erectile dysfunction has three common paths by which it can affect a man. The main one being inflammation. And this happens to men who have periodontal disease. Perio means around, dontal means dental, meaning the teeth. So around the teeth are the gums. And when the gums are inflamed, they are inflamed because abnormal bacteria that either do not belong in the mouth at all or do not belong at that place on the tooth, because the oral microbiome is certainly not as large in the number of members as is the gut microbiome, but the oral microbiome is very, very specific. In fact, you can have a colony of bacteria on one side of a tooth that is different from the colony of bacteria on the other side of the tooth. So there is still a very strong community of bacteria. They're all interacting with one another, but they're very they have their own turf, and they're very specific about that turf. The problem happens when there is an imbalance, a dysbiosis, and when that happens, then bacteria that promote inflammation tend to get into spaces in the mouth, particularly where there are pockets where the gum has come away a little bit from the tooth. And those abnormal bacteria can get into those pockets, they can grow, and that creates inflammation. The gum becomes inflamed, and sometimes it can erode into the bone, into the tooth itself. So that inflammation is the first problem when it comes to the causation of ED, because chronic inflammation anywhere in the body tends to cause the blood vessels in the body to become thicker, narrower, scarred, and weaker. So inflammation in the mouth tends to promote inflammation in other parts of the body because, well, in particular for two reasons. Number one, in general, everything that happens in the mouth, the organism is paying close attention to, because we put food into the mouth and we need to know a lot about the food before it goes down and gets absorbed in the gut. So there's a lot of attention is being paid to what's going on in the mouth. If it's inflamed, that means the organism is aware that there is inflammation, and that awareness will at the very least not discourage inflammation elsewhere. The other reality is that the bacteria that are in the mouth that are pathogenic, that are creating this inflammation, can get into the bloodstream via the blood vessels around in the gum. When that tissue starts to become not as vigorous, not as viable as it was before. So if those bacteria get into the bloodstream, then they can go to other parts of the body and create inflammation there as well. So inflammation in the organism in general, and inflammation in the blood vessels in general, in particular inflammation in the blood vessels in the genital region, will restrict the blood flow. And of course, it's blood flow that creates an erection in the first place. And since the blood vessels in the male organ tend to be smaller than some of the other bigger blood vessels in the body, it's easier for them to be narrowed and to prevent sufficient blood from getting into the penis to create an erection. The second way that there can be a problem originating in the mouth but affecting the genitals is via generalized damage to the cardiovascular system. That's what these bacteria that do when they get into the bloodstream. Possibly the worst thing that can happen is infective endocarditis, which means the bacteria sometimes can get into the heart and create an infection there. That's a very bad thing. But just in general, people who suffer from gum disease are twice as likely to develop coronary artery disease, and they are more likely to have a stroke. So in general, when your gums are inflamed, your entire cardiovascular system suffers. And third, diabetes. Periodontal disease can trigger diabetes. Diabetic patients are more likely to develop periodontal disease. And of course, this brings us back to this awareness that Dr. Scott was just talking about, of the fact that when you are taking in sugary drinks all day long, even if you're not a football player for FC Barcelona, even if you're just a normal person and you have gone to your convenience store and got a 72-ounce big gulp that you're driving around with all day long, that means you're taking in acids and you're taking in sweets all day long. And your system, remember, your sensory apparatus is always paying attention to your mouth. It's taking in that information, the sweets, the acids, the sweets, the acids all the time. And this is having a negative effect on the ability of your insulin in your body to do its job, and in general of your body to maintain a healthy level of blood sugar in your organism all day long. So there are these are just some very simple examples of, number one, how important the oral microbiome is, how much it interacts with the other parts of the organism, and how we are only at the beginning of understanding all of the interactions that exist here. So on that note, I believe Dr. Scott will join me in requesting all of you to come and attend the course next month. And I would also like to encourage everyone to have a very happy, healthy, and productive new year, particularly because while one can imagine that this year could be even worse than last year was, it's somewhat difficult to do so. So, Dr. Scott, I look forward to seeing you next month. And everybody out there, Happy New Year.
Thank you. Happy New Year to everybody.